Hello everyone! What if Naruto had Kaido's devil fruit power? Anyways, it's a Naruto x Kukaku story since I've noticed there's too few stories that feature her, so I sought to rectify that. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. Let's start the story. When someone thinks about being royalty, one usually thinks of three things: fame, money, power. From an average person's perspective, being royalty means having the best life in the world. It sounds great, but in most cases it's far removed from reality. This was something Namake's Naruto found out very early on. He's a blonde young man, at least young in soul standards as he's only about 130. He wore clothing very different from the other Shinigami. Rather than the black shihakusho, he wore slim-fitting black pants he'd liked from the world of the living, a plain white t-shirt, and plain black shoes. This wasn't the traditional uniform of the Shinigami, he'd been told over and over, but he didn't care. Much to the chagrin of the Namake's clan elders. They pestered him day in and day out about anything and everything. What to wear, how to eat, who to socialize with, proper etiquette. They basically tried to control every aspect of his life to their liking. Being the heir of one of the 5 noble clans meant he had traditions to uphold, they told him. It was ironic really. When granted everything, you can't do anything. At least that's how it seemed to work in his clan. He often wondered if the other 4 clans worked the same way. The Namake's clan was rumored to be able to transform into animals. Though no one has been able to do it in the past 800 or so years. Many believe it to be a simple legend, but unbeknownst to everyone there was some truth to it. He himself was able to transform. It was a secret he'd kept to himself since he discovered he had the ability. If the elders knew about it, who knew what kind of bullshit they'd try to throw at him? He had no intention of revealing it until he came across an opponent strong enough for him to use it, or he was put in a situation where he had no choice. Unfortunately for him, opponents strong enough to force him into a transformation were hard to find. He wasn't allowed to fight the head captain, and he couldn't just barge into any of the squads to pick fights with the members. Seeing as he was privately trained, he had yet to join a division but would most likely end up in the 5th as was tradition for his clan. But he didn't know. All he knew was that the only person he could battle it out with were his private trainers. Naruto-sama, the elders are requesting your presence. He heard a young woman tell him from the other side of the door to his room. It was one of the many maids that served the Namake's clan. Yes, thank you for telling me. He replied as he grabbed his zanpakuto that was leaning against the door frame. Unlike any other Shinigami zanpakuto, however, if one were to look closely they'd notice his was sealed with a white material holding the sheath and hilt together. Opening the door, he walked past the young woman and made his way to the front door. Naruto-sama, the elders are in the other direction. The woman warned him. Without turning around, the heir responded, I know, but I'm not going. If you keep upsetting them they might push for you to be exiled from the clan. She tried reasoning with him. She knew it was useless, however, when instead of scaring him into going he simply turned around and crossed his fingers with a hopeful look on his face. Tell them you did your best, but I couldn't care less, and left. It's not like you'll be lying. With his piece said, he closed the door and made his way down the streets of the Soul Society. As he walked he couldn't help but think of his situation. He was talented at Kaido, incredibly so, being able to cast high-level spells without the use of an incantation. He had the ability to transform into a powerful creature but couldn't reveal it yet, and had so much spiritual pressure he needed to have his friend Urahara develop a special limiter for him to keep it from leaking. To the average Shinigami this didn't sound like a problem at all. It meant you were powerful. His problem, however, was because of that fact. What good is being powerful if you can never use that power completely? He was so absorbed in his thoughts he never noticed the groups of Shinigami that would eye his sealed zanpakuto with curiosity. He continued to walk aimlessly, having no real destination in mind. All he wanted was to leave the compound before the elders started bitching at him again. It would be nice to enjoy time to himself without having to see anything that reminded him of the clan. But that was it. He flash-stepped forward at incredible speeds until he made it out of the Siriidii. A bit of moving later he stopped when he found a bar somewhere in District 1 of the Rukangai. Making his way inside he ignored everyone as they stared at him. Some with contempt, others with curiosity. It wasn't exactly a secret that Shinigami weren't that well liked around the Rukangai. He made his way to the stool in front of the bartender and looked behind the man at the selection. What'll you have? The man asked. Saga. Doesn't matter what kind as long as it has some kick to it. He answered by dropping some coins on the countertop that were quickly scooped up. As he waited he glanced around the room, seeing if there was anyone of interest. By interest he meant potentially powerful. Unfortunately for him none of them were suppressing power like he'd hoped. He turned back around when the bartender placed the shot glass in front of him. He put the glass up to his lips ready to take it down but stopped just as the glass touched his bottom lip. Quickly turning around he stared at the entrance and for a second nothing happened. A second later, however, a woman entered the establishment. He couldn't lie, the first thing his eyes were drawn to was the woman's giant chest. She was a rather short woman with long black hair wearing a white skirt with a slit on the right side that reached to her hip. Along with that she wore a red robe that hugged her figure nicely and displayed her cleavage generously. Finally her feet were wrapped in bandages and walked on wooden sandals. He recognized the woman immediately as Kukaku Shiba. Like him, she looked around before her eyes locked with his and she raised an eyebrow at him. Now knowing who he'd sensed, he turned back around and downed his shot. Well, what do we have here? I never expected to run into the heir of the Namikaze clan in a rundown bar in the Rukangai. The woman said, taking a seat next to him. He raised an eyebrow at the woman. I could say the same thing about you. He countered. I always come here. The elders are busy bugging my brother since he's gonna be the next clan head of the Shiba. She explained before also ordering then downing a shot. If you don't mind me asking, what are you doing here? He shrugged. I didn't want to hear what the old fossils wanted to say, so I left. All they ever do is pester me about leading the clan and whatnot. This drew a laugh from the Bustu woman. You're different than I imagined. That got his attention. How so? I've only heard from my family about you. Seeing as I don't really give a damn about all the clan politics, I don't bother to go to social events or anything. From what I heard, you were the perfect aristocrat. Kind of like the Kuchiki heir. She explained. The blonde smiled. I can act when the situation calls for it. So it wasn't because the elders forced you to do shit? She asked with a teasing smile. He scoffed in amusement. They can try, but I usually don't listen. They keep threatening to have me disowned because I refuse to bend at the knee to them. I wish they would be honest. Kukaku chuckled at his misfortune and ordered them another round of drinks. That's how Kain feels, but he'll never actually act on it. Believe it or not, he really wants to try and change how the Shiba clan operates. I think elders have too much power, and from what I'm hearing it's the same in your clan. The two continued to down shots for a few more minutes in comfortable silence before she spoke again. Tell me, if you're not interested in leading the clan, what do you want? She asked, genuinely curious. If she was honest, he was different from some of the other nobles she'd met. He was a breath of fresh air, and she'd only been talking to him for a few minutes before she found that out. Most men she interacted with were the sons of other nobles who'd try and win her hand, all promising a good life in exchange for her becoming a trophy wife. The Namikaze heir, however, was similar to her. He didn't care. Naruto stayed silent for a moment, trying to find the right words. At the expense of sounding like that Neanderthal Kenpachi, I want to fight strong opponents. That and have fun while I can before one day settling down with someone. What about you? Kukaku crossed one leg over the other before taking another shot. Pretty much the same thing. Have fun while I can, experiment with new fireworks and see where the afterlife takes me. I'll drink that. Oi, two more over here. He shouted to the bartender. The Bustu woman smirked at his exclamation. Now you're talking. I got 100,000 ken that says I can outdrink you. She told him with a smug smile on her face. You're on. The two managed to clean out the bar supply of alcohol that day, and for the first time in a long time Naruto had a good time. Nothing could ruin this feeling. Unfortunately for him, he spoke too soon. The next day. His day was not going as well as yesterday had. He'd been woken up to one of the maids of the compound knocking on his door telling him he'd been summoned to the elder chambers once more. Begrudgingly, he got dressed and made his way down there. He figured if he went maybe he could get them off his back for a good while. He reached the giant extravagant doors that had one half of the Namikaze clan emblem on each door. Without bothering to knock, he pushed them open, which seemed to upset the old geezers if the frowns on their faces were any indication. Sitting in front of a small table were two old men and one old woman. All three motioned to him to sit in the empty seat on the couch across from them. Where are my parents? Naruto asked as he sat down and rested one leg atop the other. Glancing around, he noticed it was just the four of them. Normally his parents were present for these summonings. Why his old man let these three continue to have a say in what goes on, he'll never know. They're away on business for the next few days. The old woman answered. As to why you're here, we've let you run around doing as you please for years. He scoffed at the let you bit, but she continued as if he hadn't done anything. But it's time you begin fulfilling your duties as clan heir. Out with it. Being around you bothers me. He replied, now aggravated. The two older men narrowed his eyes at his blatant disrespect but held their tongue. We're arranging for you to be married soon. We're in talks with some of the other noble clans and will be working on a contract." Naruto stared at them with contempt clear in his face but said nothing. He simply stood up and made his way to the door. "We aren't finished speaking, child." "No, but I'm done listening," he shot back as he made his way out. The butlers and maids of the compound all moved aside as he walked by them. All of them clearly wondered what they'd told him to put him in such a bad mood this time. It was after all no secret of his disdain for the elders. 10 years later. The next couple of years went by in a blur for the blonde heir. In that time he continued working on his Kaido and Hakuda on an almost daily basis. He was proud and annoyed that he could cast most of the spells he knew without an incantation. Proud because he knew how difficult it was for Shinigami to do this, and annoyed because he still had no one to use them against in full capacity. His relationship with Kukaku also grew in that time. After formally meeting that first time at the bar, the two would continuously meet up there every few days. The two would drink for hours before going to set off any new experimental fireworks the woman had cooked up. Soon the two could be seen frequenting one another's homes for hours on end, just enjoying each other's company. They mostly spent time at the Shiba compound, however, as the blonde didn't care to be home often these days. Though when he was home the maids would comment that he looked happier when Kukaku was around. Similarly, Isshin and Kain would remark that Kukaku had become a lot less violent, at least whenever he was around. She was violent as it was. He shuddered thinking about how violent she must have been before. They were teased a lot by the Shiba clan, saying that they were attached at the hip. The two young souls didn't know it, but there was a bet going on in the woman's household to see which of the two would confess first. The elders of his family, however, weren't as amused as the Shiba. They constantly reminded him about his impending wedding and told him to stop affiliating with Kukaku. Did he listen to them? Of course not. "Naruto-sama, where are you going?" asked one of the maids as he was leaving the estate. "I promised to take Kukaku to dinner since I messed up her last firework." That would explain the reason he was dressed in a nice-looking black kimono rather than his usual getup. Making his way over to her house, he went to knock on the door but didn't get the chance to knock as Isshin opened before his knuckles could touch the door. "Well, look at you," the older man teased. "I thought this was just you making it up to her by buying her food? You look like you're here for a date." Naruto turned his head away from the man, not letting him get the satisfaction of knowing his teasing was getting to him. "Oi, shut up. Come on, let's go," Kukaku yelled at him as she came down the stairs. Grabbing him by the hand, the woman pulled him out of the building before he could comment on her clothing. Like him, she too wore a kimono, though hers was a light red with sakura petal prints all over it. It really hugged her figure well. She finally let him go once they'd made it out of Suriidii and settled down to a slower pace until they came upon a nice-looking stall. An elderly woman took their orders and commented on how cute the two looked together. After that initial bout of embarrassment, the two fell back into their usual routine. Order some sake and talk about whatever was on their mind. The two sat there eating and enjoying each other's company for about 2 hours before they decided to call it a day. As the two walked down the dimly lit street, Naruto couldn't help but notice that it was emptier than it should be. The two took 2 steps forward before jumping away from each other just as a red ball of energy landed where Kukaku had just been standing. They were forced to jump away again as a rain of red energy blasts began coming down. From his viewpoint, he could count 8 quickly coming at each of them. Sensing someone to his left, he quickly ducked underneath a kick and pointed a finger at the assailant's head. "Byakurai," he said quietly. A small white bolt of lightning generated at his fingertip before easily piercing through the man's head. Before the lifeless body could hit the ground, Naruto grabbed it and threw it at one of the Kaido blasts that was coming down, effectively using him as a meat shield. Looking over, he saw Kukaku had dropped 3 while 3 more were surrounding her. Flash stepped over to her and he kneed one in the stomach and snapped its neck the moment they bent down. Quickly moving to another target, he chopped this one in the back of the neck while Kukaku blasted 2 more through the chest with a Kaido spell. At this point only one assailant remained, and after seeing the others go down without much trouble tried to retreat. However, before he could try, he was pinned to the nearest wall courtesy of a Bakudo 62 Hyaparankin. The blonde walked up to the masked man with an angry look on his face. "Who sent you and for what?" The man glared at him but refused to respond. His lack of response earned him a punch to the gut and one to the face. "I'll ask again. Who sent you and for what?" "He's not gonna talk to Naruto," Kukaku said as she walked up next to him, giving the bad assassin an unimpressed look. "Oh, he'll talk," Naruto told her as a sadistic smile appeared on his face. Grabbing the man by the arm, he channeled energy and began casting a Kaido spell at point-blank range. The result of this was the man's arm beginning to turn black as it was burned. He kept it up for a couple of seconds while the man thrashed around begging him to stop. As long as you have something useful to say, you'll stay alive. The Namikaze elders? He swallowed. We were paid to kill the woman. That's all he squealed. Looking over to the woman, he wasn't surprised to see her eyes narrowed in anger. Turning back to their captured enemy, he blasted him in the head with a quick Byakurai. The two immediately stepped back to the Shiba clan compound where Isshin was told of the events of the night. To say the man was mad was an understatement. Both he and Kain looked ready to kill someone. They wouldn't be getting the chance, however. Shiba-sama, Isshin was surprised to hear that coming from the boy's mouth, as normally he just called him Ishi. Can I ask a favor of you? Please don't interfere with what's about to happen, was all he said before leaving their home. The family was puzzled at the statement, none more so than Kukaku, who immediately chased after him. What are you going to do? She asked as she caught up to him and grabbed him by the wrist. By now every maid and butler has already left the compound and my parents are away again. That means only the elders are in there right now. He explained. So what, you're going to confront them? They won't admit to it. Let's just consult with the Shiba clan and we'll handle them. She pleaded. To her dismay, her friend only shook his head no. It's one thing to try and kill me, but they went after you just because they don't like me spending time with you. That's unforgivable. Naruto, what are you going to do? The blonde simply looked at her before pulling her into a hug. I might not see you for a while after this. What do you mean? She didn't like where this was going. I mean, I'm most likely gonna have Soul Society coming after me if I stick around for any longer after tonight. He tried to leave but couldn't as the Bustu woman kept her arms wrapped around him. I knew you were arranged to be married and I still stuck around getting closer and closer to you. This is partially my fault too. So wherever you go I go. She shocked him by leaning upwards and capturing her lips with his. Breaking apart, the two looked at each other for a second before smiling slightly. Alright, we can do that again later. For now let's go. What do you want me to do? She asked seriously. Send a hell butterfly to Urahara and tell him I'm calling in a favor. Have him set up a senkaman and have living arrangements made in the human world. Tell him I need it within the hour. She nodded and disappeared from her spot. Most likely telling her family what she'd decided. He was right, as not too long after Isshin appeared next to him and placed his hand on his shoulder. I know I don't have to tell you, but please take care of Kukaku. With my life. The man looked him in the eyes and nodded, satisfied with what he'd seen. Take care of yourself. With everything prepared, he made his way until he was in the Rukongai again. This time, however, he was still close enough to see the gate of the Siriidii. Taking a deep breath, he prepared himself for what he was about to do. You've been a pain in my ass for the last time, he said out loud before letting out a loud scream. His spiritual pressure began to skyrocket at an immense rate, enough so that the ground and buildings around him began to crack and even fall apart. If anyone were around to see him, they'd see his skin beginning to turn blue and horns beginning to emerge from his forehead and atop his head. His face began stretching as a snout grew before the rest of his neck extended. His body began to bulk up considerably, as well as having scales begin to emerge atop his skin. The rest of his body extended upwards as well, and his legs turned into a tail. Transformation complete, he took to the now cloudy skies. At this point, everyone in the Rukongai and Siriidii was looking up at the cloudy sky as lightning began striking random spots. One ray of lightning pierced the sky, and everyone saw the visage of a dragon's face. Shinigami began swarming the streets of the Siriidii, ready to protect it from the possible attack. They'd had invaders before in their history, but never a dragon. They watched in awe as two giant arms emerged from the clouds before a head did as well. Knowing he didn't have much time, he looked straight at the Namikaze clan compound and opened his mouth. Red light began forming before it took the shape of a sphere and began growing in size. Knowing an attack was coming, hundreds of shields made by the Shinigami began going up quickly. Blast breath, he thought before letting off the attack. The red ball transformed into a straight beam that headed in the direction of the compound. Everyone watched in shock as it easily tore through the shields that had been erected and made its way to the Namikaze estate. The ground shook violently as the attack hit, and everything within a couple miles behind the estate was destroyed. Coming back down to the ground, he transformed back into his human form and made a break for it. Luckily, everyone was scrambling due to the destruction the attack had caused, which let him make it to Urahara with no trouble. When he arrived, the man motioned at him to follow him quickly. I don't have much time. As much as I'd like to know how you did that, it'll have to wait. Here's the documents you'll need. Your home is ready, as are your jigais. Urahara told him as he handed him everything he'd need. Thank you, Urahara. I owe you big time. I don't know how, but I'll repay you for this someday. The man just smiled and covered his face with his fan. I'll definitely keep that in mind. Now go. With that, the two young souls made their way through the Senkamen and disappeared. Chapter 2. The sound of loud thuds resonated through the room as one by one, training dummies hit the ground. Some were charred, with not a single visible spot that wasn't black. Light smoke could be seen still rising off of the material. Other dummies in the room had large dents in different parts of them, clearly done by blunt force. Some had their ribs completely caved in, others had the heads removed, and some were almost flattened. Had any normal person taken hits like this, they would have died on the spot. Naruto wiped the sweat off his face and took in the sight before him. The underground training room that Urahara had installed in the house was one of the things he was most thankful for. He and Kukaku could train down here and all of their residual energy wouldn't be leaked out in case there were any Shinigami nearby. Lifting his right hand up, he snapped his fingers and in a flash, 5 glowing orbs manifested an inch above each appendage. With but a mental command, the 5 orbs shot out and expanded as they moved away from him until they came in contact with the ruined training dummies. He closed his eyes as the explosion let off a bright light, and when he opened them again, he was pleased to see there was nothing left of them. I'll have to ask Kasuke to get me a few more of those. An image of the bucket hat wearing man flashed through Naruto's mind and his thoughts began to change. A lot had changed in the past 100 years or so. Kasuke and Yoruichi, the two best friends he and Kukaku had when they were in the Soul Society, had made their way down to the world of the living. It was quite a shock to see them out of the blue one day as they were making their way home. Kasuke invited the two of them to his place to catch up and fill them in on what had happened. Aizen Sosuke, the lieutenant of the 5th Division under Shinji Hirako, had been conducting experiments on souls and had managed to frame Kasuke for it. Naruto had never met Aizen. He'd heard of him here and there, sure, but never got the chance to formally meet him. He was sure that he'd have worked under him had he stayed in the Soul Society, as his clan always went to the 5th. Now that he'd heard of the man's nefarious side, he was more glad that he did what he did and fled. The first thing the two new refugees had done upon arrival was look for the two of them at their home and only luckily stumbled upon them after realizing they weren't home. He'd led them back to their base, which was essentially a candy shop in town, a pretty good front in his opinion. While there, the man continued doing research while Yoruichi gathered information on any Shinigami around by going out in her cat form. The blonde wasn't sure how Yoruichi was able to transform. As far as he knew, only his clan had that ability to do so, even though it was said no one had done so in the past few years. Perhaps there was some very distant connection between their clans? He wasn't sure, but he didn't question it too much. They also told him how the Siriidii had indeed been on the lookout for him ever since he escaped. It didn't take long for them to put the pieces together and realize that he was, in fact, the dragon that attacked. He'd vanished without a trace, and considering he was the only one left unaccounted for, it was easy to deduce. Not only that, Kukaku had also been marked a criminal. The Shiba household had been questioned soon after the event, and with her missing it was only natural to assume she'd fled with him. Another major event revolved around the captain of the 10th Division. Isshin Shiba, who now went by Kurosaki, lived near them. They'd been shocked when they ran into the man a few years ago on their street. Isshin invited the two to his home where they met his wife Masaki and were told of the circumstances that led him to Karakura. Isshin had left the Soul Society after an incident that led him to lose his Shinigami powers. Naruto did make note that the man said it was a temporary measure but didn't know how long exactly it would be. Isshin himself didn't look too upset over the loss of his power. In fact, Kukaku said she'd never seen the man look happier than he did now. He even went on to have 3 kids, 1 boy and 2 girls who were fraternal twins. Unfortunately, the older man's happiness came to an abrupt halt not too long after. While Naruto and Kukaku were away one day, Masaki was killed by a hollow, leaving Isshin a widower of 3. Naruto did suspect that Isshin knew more than he was led on but didn't say anything as the man was grieving. He knew Masaki was a Quincy, unless it was a Vasto Lord. Naruto didn't see how she would be killed by a hollow. It seemed to be a trend for misfortune to occur as they had gotten news that Kaien had passed as well. Similar to Masaki, it had been hollow from what they'd been told. Kukaku was a mess for a while. She didn't want to eat or create any new fireworks. She'd lay in bed for most of the day with a dead look on her face. Most times he'd have to force her to eat by bringing food to her in bed and feeding her. The fact that she wasn't allowed to see any of her family back in Soul Society only made it that much worse. Seeing her in that state was the only time he ever questioned if the meeting was probably a bad thing. Without him, she'd still be in Soul Society, and the death of her brother may have been averted. Luckily for him, even in her depressed state, she reassured him that she didn't regret coming with him. It took a few months for her to get back on her feet and back to normal, but she'd done it. Yoruichi had gotten word that Ganju had stepped up and taken the reins of the Shiba clan. Hearing that her youngest brother had stopped goofing around and took control of the family had a big part in Kukaku's mental state returning to normal. Still, between all the misfortune that occurred to everyone around them, there was some good news. The biggest change that had happened to them in the past 100 or so years had only occurred a few months ago. Naruto. He heard Kukaku call out from upstairs. He made his way out of their training ground and his eyes widened when he saw Kukaku. In a split second he was in front of her and took the large box she was carrying out of her hands, much to the woman's anger. "Will you stop that?" she yelled, clearly aggravated. Naruto looked at her with a confused look. "Stop what? Treating me like I'll break or something will happen to me by doing the simplest things. I'm pregnant, not crippled," she responded. That was possibly the biggest change in Naruto's life so far. The two had married officially in the world of the living years ago, and now, Kukaku sported a rather large bump. Naruto had noticed that soon after Masaki had been pregnant with Isshin's first child, Kukaku had become much more affectionate with him. She was always brash and outspoken, unafraid to tell him when he was being stupid, but after seeing how Masaki and Isshin looked, there was a change in her. Whenever they'd go out she'd latch onto his arm all night, kisses on the mouth and cheek, and slow lovemaking in bed. Usually she liked it rough until she couldn't walk right, so he knew something was amiss. That went on for a while, and when word got out that Masaki was pregnant once more, Kukaku finally came out and admitted that she wanted to try for a baby. She looked nervous, which was a strong contrast to her usual brash demeanor, and admitted that she was afraid of how he'd react, so she never outright said it. This time though she laid it out on the table, and to her immense delight, Naruto was on the same page. Multiple times over the years, he'd thought of what it would be like to have a family of his own. Sometimes he'd picture what his future kids would look like and also wanted to approach the subject. When she finally said she wanted one, he didn't hesitate and agreed. The two began trying immediately without any form of anti-pregnancy precautions. Fortunately for them, they had no issues on that front, and Kukaku soon found herself pregnant with their first child. To Naruto's utter delight, they found out it was going to be a boy. Now they were only a month or so away from Kukaku's due date. The blonde really wished Masaki was alive to see the birth of their child, but that would never come to pass. "You're almost due. What happens if this causes something?" he responded worriedly. "I'm still a month off and the box is light," she said in a softer voice. "I know you're worried, and I appreciate it, but I'll be fine." Naruto sighed. "Okay, what do you need?" "I just needed you to move some of your stuff off the ground," she said, pointing to a few objects on the ground. A pair of his shoes were sprawled out a few feet apart, as was his zanpakuto. To this day, Naruto still had the hilt and sheath sealed so that it couldn't be unsheathed. He still hadn't come across anyone worth unsheathing it for. "Why are you training right now anyway?" Kukaku asked. "Don't you have papers to grade?" she added as she sat down on the couch and subconsciously rubbed her stomach. Shit. He'd forgotten about that. Urahara had told him in order to blend better, he needed to get a job. Something normal. Isshin worked part-time as a doctor, running a clinic in his home. Urahara himself was a salesman, a candy salesman, but still had money coming in and had a legit job. At least to the general public. He'd hopped around from odd job to odd job until he landed on being a teacher at Kukaku's insistence. He retained information quickly and absorbed it like a sponge. He was able to teach her high-level Kaido spells easily and was patient. If he could make it through her tantrums all those years and never lose his cool, he could easily teach a bunch of schoolchildren. It only took him a few days of reading some history books before he knew all he needed. Coincidentally, he ended up being Ichigo's homeroom teacher. Isshin's son was a little rough around the edges, but he was a good kid. Naruto didn't understand why Isshin didn't tell the boy about the Shinigami or Quincy, but it wasn't his place to say anything. On the subject of Quincy's, he had one of those in his class too. He wasn't sure at first, but he'd caught a glimpse of the cross the boy carried and instantly knew. While Isshin didn't tell Ichigo about the gods of death, Naruto was certain Isshin knew Ichigo was a Shinigami already. He and Kukaku had seen the boy around the city in the black garbs all the Shinigami wore. What really threw the two for a loop was the company that Ichigo was keeping. Byakuya's younger sister was often seen running around with him fighting hollows. Naruto knew Kasuke must have been involved with them as well, since shortly after her appearance, she ended up transferring into his class. He was sure the shopkeeper had a blast placing her in his class specifically. What was baffling to the blonde was that he couldn't think of a reason for her to stay this long. There weren't so many hollows in the area that she needed to be here for an extended amount of time. He'd made his concerns be known to his wife, but she told him to just sit back and watch things unfold. If that blonde doofus is involved, he most likely has it under some control, she'd said to him. Naruto had his doubts. Kisuke was smart, resourceful, and generally had a good head on his shoulders. However, his curiosity as a scientist had put him in plenty of unfavorable situations in the past. Ichigo was part Shinigami and Quincy, which meant the man was probably taking notes every time the young man fought to study him further. Naruto sighed and picked up the small mess he'd made before making his way over to a small desk he had set up next to the TV in the living room. He pulled out a black book bag from one of the drawers and took out a good number of sheets. Naruto stared at the stack in front of him and turned around. Kukaku. He trailed off, a pleading tone could be heard in his voice. The woman didn't even look at him, her eyes were focused on the TV as she flipped through the channels. No. You don't even know what I was going to say? He whined. She rolled her eyes. You're going to ask me to help you grade your students' papers, again? She replied. Do it yourself, our son and I are watching TV. She added with her hands on her stomach. Seeing that he wouldn't be getting help from her, he resigned himself to his fate and pulled out the red pen. He made his marks page after page, sometimes wondering how some of these students managed to dress themselves in the morning with some of the answers they provided. The next morning, Naruto found himself in the teacher's lounge making himself a cup of coffee before classes started. He found it funny how even when he was no longer a student, he was still attending a school. Granted, the school only taught regular courses as opposed to Zenjutsu, Hakuda, Hohu, and Kaido, but the point still remained. Good morning, Namike-sensei. Naruto's still half-lidded eyes turned to the woman who was talking to him. Oki Misato stood in front of him looking ready for the day. She wore a red long-sleeve button-up with black pants and shoes and looked like she'd been up for hours already. The volume of her voice told him that she was very much a morning person. Good morning, Oki-sensei. How are you today? He asked, trying to be cordial. The woman beamed at him. Wonderful. I finished grading early yesterday and managed to get my grocery shopping done and get a little workout in. She informed him. Naruto looked at her biceps. For a regular human, they weren't bad, he supposed. Anyway, how's your class treating you? Are you adjusting well? She asked. He nodded. Yeah, they're not that bad. They pay attention and follow directions, so it's not too bad. He replied, taking a sip of his coffee. Oki nodded in agreement. You got lucky to have a good class for your first year teaching? She commented before taking a look at the clock on the small microwave. Naruto noticed her gaze and saw that there was only 5 minutes left before classes started. The two teachers began making their way out into the hall that was now full of students heading to their homerooms. Naruto noticed an orange-haired teen walking a few steps ahead of them and debated saying something about his after-school activities but refrained. Well, I'll see you during lunch. Remember, if you need anything, feel free to ask. She offered kindly. Naruto smiled. I'll be sure to let you know if anything comes up, thank you. Oki smiled back and entered her classroom, which was 2 doors away from his. Kurosaki, he called out. While they were acquainted, he never called the young man by name in school. Ichigo turned around, his trademark scowl present on his face. Yes? Any reason your assignment from yesterday was incomplete? He asked, already knowing the reason. To his credit, Ichigo didn't look nervous at all. Sorry, sensei, I did most of it in class and thought I had finished. Won't happen again, he replied casually. It was a good lie. The boy often did finish work quickly in class, so it would be easy to let something like that happen once or twice. Naruto stared at him as they walked but nodded. Be sure it doesn't. Your old man might be onto something when he says you're a delinquent slacker. He mumbled to himself just loud enough for Ichigo to hear. His words had the intended effect as the boy's scowl deepened, much to his amusement. Ichigo must have seen this was what he wanted as the scowl quickly disappeared, replaced with a smirk. That's fine. Next time I see Kukaku, I just might mention how Oki-sensei always seems to be around you when she gets the chance. He mumbled back. Naruto's eyes narrowed. That wouldn't be good. The last time Kukaku caught a woman trying to come on to him, it had nearly resulted in him sleeping on the couch. They had been walking through the mall shopping for maternity clothes a few months into her pregnancy. She went to the bathroom, and while she was gone, a young woman in her early 30s had come up to him asking him for his name and what he was doing alone before asking for his number. Kukaku had quickly shut her down by wrapping her arm around his and making sure her wedding ring was on display. The woman quickly realized what was happening and apologized before leaving. His wife hadn't been upset that he'd been hit on, but rather that he hadn't put a stop to it once she started. Normally, she wasn't the jealous type and even played along in teasing him with Yoruichi whenever they could, but her hormones were all out of whack due to her pregnancy. Okay, how about we don't do that? He relented. The school day was simple enough, a little lecture for a few minutes followed by a short documentary that took care of the rest for the remainder of the class. Once the school day ended and the kids were allowed to leave or head to their clubs, Naruto stayed behind to get ahead on some work. As he continued drawing up plans for the next few days, he couldn't help but feel a little off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something was telling him that something was going to happen. 5 minutes later and the feeling got stronger. Just as he was putting his pen to the paper, he felt it. Multiple sources of Ryuryoku began appearing one after another not too far from the school. As quickly as they appeared, however, they'd disappear before being replaced by another. Hollow bait, Naruto realized. Getting up from his chair, he quickly made his way to the teacher's lounge and pulled out a small orb from his pocket after entering the restroom. Taking the pill, his soul was ejected from his physical body and in his place was something Kasuke called a mod soul. The artificial soul inhibiting his body gave him a thumbs up and made his way out of the bathroom, cheerfully greeting the lone teacher that had made his way to the lounge. Now, he was back in his untraditional Shinigami clothes. He jumped out the nearest window and began making his way towards where he felt all the hollows. As he got closer, he could easily guess who was responsible for killing them. He stopped a good distance away from the action and sat down in the air, genuinely curious to see how well Ichigo fought. The boy was decent and his senjutsu needed quite a bit of work, as there was no technique to his attacks, just brute strength. Next to him was another one of his students, Ishida, who was destroying them just as quickly using a bow he'd created out of Reisher. Are they having some kind of competition? The blonde wondered to himself as he watched the two continue to destroy hollows. Naruto sensed a hollow coming up behind him but paid him no mind. As Ishida shot down a hollow, the one creeping up on him decided to make its move and turn him into a meal. At least, that's how it would have gone if he was normal. The closer the hollow got, Naruto slowly began enhancing his body with a very low partial transformation. His skin was now as hard as the scales that his dragon form granted him. The hollow bit down, only for its teeth to be destroyed upon contact with him. Naruto finally turned his head and stared unimpressed at the vile creature. Even with me suppressing most of my power, you should have known that wouldn't work. Naruto commented, not that the hollow could understand him. Shaking his head at himself, he reached forward and easily punched through the mask, making the hollow disintegrate into small particles. Turning his attention back to the action, he couldn't help but notice that a large tear in the sky had manifested and he knew exactly what was coming. A large hollow, with what seemed to be a black flowing cloak, began slowly making its way out of the tear in space. A Minos Grande? Naruto actually said out loud. Let's see how you deal with this, boys. If he had been drinking something, he'd spit it out when he saw what the two students were doing. Yurio had Ichigo's Zanpakuto tied to his head. It reminded him of a unicorn's horn. While it looked ridiculous, he could see what the intent was. Ichigo's Ryatsu was like a flowing faucet, constantly leaking and uncontrolled. Ishida was using that large amount of Ryatsu to power a large arrow and hopefully destroy the Minos in one shot. Unfortunately for him, it seemed Ichigo wasn't having it as he ran forward, sword in hand, despite the Minos charging up a Zero. Naruto stayed in his sitting position, not because he wasn't worried, but rather because Kasuke was down there with Byakuya's sister watching the action unfold. The blonde was very impressed that the orange-haired teen managed to hold off the blast and even counter. It wasn't enough to destroy it, but it was enough for it to seemingly retreat back into the void. He stood up. Well, that was interesting. He looked down and saw Kasuke smirk in his direction just before he dashed back to school. Maybe in the future he might be a good challenge. First he needs some experience fighting actual Shinigami though. Ichigo's chance came a lot faster than Naruto anticipated. A few weeks later, as he was out buying some food for Kukaku, who had just had another craving, he sensed two powerful individuals. He was going to ignore them, but two familiar Ryatsu signatures also began moving in the direction of the newcomers. One of them had massive amounts leaking, so it wasn't difficult to tell who that was, and the other could be no one other than Kasuke. He hoped Kukaku wouldn't be too upset that he was late and made his way over as well. He made it just in time to see Ichigo let off a large amount of energy as he stood against a red-haired Shinigami. Naruto's eyes looked behind the man and he couldn't help but pity Ichigo slightly. If Byakuya decides to get involved, it's over, he thought. He was sure Kasuke would prevent him from dying, but Naruto didn't want him to explain to Isshin what had happened. He smiled proudly when Ichigo fought through the pain in his shoulder after being hit by the redhead's shuriken and managed to get a clean hit and apply pressure. Too bad his good fortune came to an abrupt halt as Byakuya finally acted. Just as Ichigo was going to get another hit in, his Zanpakuto broke courtesy of the nobleman. In the blink of an eye it was over. Byakuya struck with deadly precision which left the young Shinigami in shock. The nobleman didn't stop there as he pierced the boy once more before turning away. Ichigo probably had no idea what happened to him as he fell face first on the concrete. Naruto took a step forward to intervene, ready to show himself to someone who would undoubtedly recognize him, but stopped. Ichigo gripped the captain's ankle, refusing to back down, but was kicked away by the man's sister. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but Ichigo looked shocked and hurt. The blonde watched as the red-headed man opened up a senkamen and led them through. What little strength Ichigo had finally ran out and his head hit the concrete. Naruto and Kasuke both appeared before the drowned boy at the same time. "You know he's going to want to go after her," Kasuke said from behind his fan. "Yeah?" Naruto asked. Kasuke chuckled. "I've talked to Rukia since she got here and have kept up with what they've been up to. Byakuya sealed his Seketsu and Hakusui, he'll soon lose the power that Rukia lent him." Naruto thought Kasuke sounded too joyful saying that. "I assume you're going to do something about it?" "Perhaps. If I get him his power back, I know for certain he'll want to go. He'll need a guide," Kasuke added at the end. Naruto glanced at the bucket hat wearing man inside. "Keep me updated. I gotta get these to Kukaku." His fellow blonde waved him off happily and picked Ichigo up. Naruto made his way home, the entire time thinking about Kasuke's words. It looked like he might be heading home in the near future. A few days had passed since he stumbled upon Ichigo fighting against Byakuya and his lieutenant, and anyone could see the immediate change in the orange-haired substitute Shinigami. His eyes looked dead, lacking the usual fire they held. He didn't pay attention in class, nor did he seem to pay as much attention to his friends. From his place at the front of the desk, he could occasionally hear people like Yasutora and in no way asking if he was alright, only to get a half-assed yen in return. Even though the boy claimed otherwise, Naruto knew he both missed the abilities he'd obtained as well as the company of Rukia, who to no surprise wasn't remembered by almost everyone in the class. What was a surprise was hearing Inoue Orihime inquiring about her where she should have been just as clueless as everyone else. Had Kasuke messed up somehow? No, that couldn't be it. He was an idiot at times, but not when having to do something important. The thought of the bucket hat wearing man passed through his mind as he finished writing on the board. Whatever it was he had planned, he needed to do it quickly. The blonde was sure whatever Kasuke was planning it would be today. It was the last day of school, meaning Ichigo would be uninterrupted by any assignments or club activity. "Well, everyone, it's just about time to finish up," Naruto called out. "Be sure to not slack off during your break. Just because we're done for now doesn't mean you can just forget everything. Don't slack off now." He finished just as the bell rang, dismissing everyone. The students celebrated loudly as they packed their things and made a beeline towards the door, eager to get their vacation started. Naruto smiled kindly at them as they made their way out, only raising an eyebrow in confusion as Orihime placed a large loaf of bread on his desk as a thank you present. Once he was alone in the room, he looked at the bread and shook his head. Orihime was a kind girl, if not a bit strange. Who gives a whole loaf of bread as a gift? Shaking his head, he stood up and grabbed an eraser to begin cleaning the whiteboard, muttering angrily as he did so. Glancing at some of the answers to the final few questions he'd put him in a bad mood. How did some of these kids make it to high school if they didn't even know the answer to some of these? He muttered to himself, wiping away the incorrect answers. Tossing the eraser to the side, he glanced out the window just in time to see Ichigo making his way out of the school grounds. Kasuke is gonna have his hands full, he thought to himself. Heading over to his desk, he began putting away all the papers he would need and trashing those he wouldn't. I'll also have to tell Kukaku soon too, he thought. She wouldn't be happy to find out her husband went back to Soul Society without saying anything. She was violent when angry even before she was pregnant. Now she could be furious and violent, or sad and cry. Neither of those options he particularly liked, so he'd have to tell her soon. She would understand though, he couldn't just let Isshin's kid go and get himself killed out there. He barely stood a chance against a lieutenant. If a captain came across him, he'd be killed with little trouble. It would be simple, go in, break Rukia out, and get back home. He briefly wondered what exactly Ichigo would do once he got her though. Knowing the boy, he probably hadn't thought that far ahead. Having his reasoning settled, he made his way out, locking the door and headed home. He walked home with a slight spring in his step, knowing his plan was set. If there was one thing he loved about Kukaku, it was her ability to think logically, sometimes, and understand when things needed to be done a certain way. She would be okay with him going. "I'm coming with you." Those were not the words he was expecting to hear from his wife. He shook his head no. "That's too dangerous. You're a month off from your due date. We're probably gonna end up fighting captains and lieutenants, one hit from them, even if you block, and the chance of losing the baby is guaranteed," he replied sternly. Kukaku wasn't about to be deterred, however, and put her hands on her hips. "I'm not going for the fighting," she admitted, causing him to relax slightly. "I want to go see my family. We left everyone and everything behind overnight. The most I know of them is what we were told from Kisuke and Yoruchi. It's been years and I want to see everyone. I'd like Ganju to know he's gonna be an uncle," he thought to himself. The Shiba clan wasn't near the gates of the Siriidii, which meant it would be safe, at least for her. The reminder that she had left without her family essentially because of him also filled him with regret. He couldn't care less about the elders, and sure, he missed his parents, but Kukaku had a good home and she'd given it up to go with him. To deny her the chance to reunite with those she loved would be cruel. Rubbing a hand down his face, he sighed. Fine. He relented. Kukaku smirked in victory, as she always did when winning an argument. Before she could reply, however, he put a hand up to stop whatever she was going to say. "You can come, but you have to stay at the house. I can't risk you being caught up in whatever might happen," he added in a serious tone. He was rarely one to order the woman around, but with something this important, she had to know there would be no negotiating. "All right." She relented. "When do we leave?" Naruto shrugged. "I'm not really sure. We'll have to wait until Kisuke finishes up helping Ichigo. In the meantime, I'm gonna talk to Isshin and let him know the plan." The blonde didn't even get the chance to head to the door before he was stopped. Kukaku sat down on their couch and shook her head. He already knows. He called the other day. Rukia had been sleeping in Ichigo's closet since she lent him her powers. It wasn't hard to detect the change in his son. Naruto blinked. Ichigo has been sleeping in the same room with Rukia? For that matter, how did Isshin know? He shouldn't be able to see her. Kukaku nodded. For a while now. As for how, Ichigo isn't subtle. Hearing him talk in the middle of the night about certain things gave it away. She replied, rubbing her stomach slowly. He could see her narrowing her eyes at the TV in annoyance and muttering under her breath before she shut it off and threw the remote across the room. Great. Looks like one of her moods was coming in. Makes sense. I wonder if Ichigo tried anything. He's at that age after all. The pregnant woman scoffed. That boy is a prude. I'd be surprised if he did. He can't even tell that big-breasted girl is practically throwing herself at him. She replied. Naruto had to concede that she had a point and chuckled in amusement. He could remember countless times in class when Orihime could be caught staring at her fellow orange-haired classmate and getting caught doing so. Even through her stuttering and blush, Ichigo would still wonder if she was okay or if she needed something. Yeah, that's true. Looking at one of the clocks they had around the house, he made his way to the door. Well, I think it's safe to assume he knows that Kisuke will be helping his kid too. I might as well go fill him in on the plan. It's best he knows Ichigo will be missing for a while. He was once again stopped, this time by the iron grip Kukaku had on his wrist. He hadn't even noticed when she'd gotten off the couch and made her way over to him. Naruto raised an eyebrow in question. Go tell him later. Right now let's go have a little fun, she said in a suggestive tone. Naruto grimaced a bit, looking down at her swollen stomach. I don't think that's a good idea considering how close you are, he replied carefully. The last thing he wanted was to make her feel ugly. His words seemed to have no effect as his wife all but began dragging him into their bedroom. She pulled the large maternity shirt she wore up off her body and tossed it carelessly on the bed, allowing him to see her slightly larger breasts once she turned around. Relax, we won't be doing that, she told him, pushing him onto the bed so that he was sitting on the edge. Our son won't be coming out of my mouth, will he? She insinuated. Naruto smiled. Maybe she was right, Isshin could wait. 10 days later. I wonder what he's had Ichigo do all this time. Naruto wondered out loud as he and Kukaku entered the man's shop. A small chime went off as they entered the establishment, and they were soon greeted by the sight of a grinning Kasuke, holding up his trust fan covering the bottom half of his face. "Naruto, Kukaku?" he said questioningly. His gaze traveled to his fellow blonde, wondering what the pregnant woman was doing here. "Kasuke," Naruto greeted. "Small change of plans, Kukaku is coming with us. She'll be staying out of the action though. She'll get to her house and wait for everything to blow over." The shop owner looked momentarily concerned, but his disposition quickly reverted to his happy-go-lucky self. His fan shut and he turned around, holding a hand in the air motioning them to follow. If that's the case, then she should be out of trouble hopefully. In any case, please follow me. Ichigo and the others are already here. Others? Naruto thought. His wife shot him a questioning look, to which he shrugged. He figured it would be Ichigo and Yoruichi most likely. Would there be more? When you say others? Naruto probed, hoping his friend would enlighten them. Don't worry, you'll meet them in a minute. I'm pretty sure you'll be surprised at who we rounded up for this little mission. Kasuke replied jovially. He led them to the entrance of the underground training room he'd created, and sure enough, Naruto was surprised at who he saw. As he suspected, Yoruichi was present in her cat form next to an equally bewildered Ichigo. Next to him, however, were Yasutora Sado, Ishida Uryu, who was dressed in the traditional clothes of Quincy, and Inoue Orihime. "Naruto?" Ichigo yelled while pointing at him. "What the hell are you doing here?" he asked. Uryu narrowed his eyes at the older blonde and pushed up his glasses before bowing slightly, an action that the other student quickly mimicked. "Sensei?" They greeted, though Uryu's voice had suspicion laced within. It was no surprise to Naruto that he would be suspicious considering his race's relationship with the Shinigami. Luckily, he wasn't stupid enough to attack. Orihime perked up and waved happily. "Sensei, did you like the bread?" Naruto's sweat dropped. That bread was still mostly intact, missing only 3 slices. "Everyone," he greeted before turning to the shop owner. "Color me surprised, Kasuke. Ishida I can kind of understand, but the others? Wait, Naruto. Kukaku, why the hell are you here? Who are you?" he asked repeatedly, then turned to Kasuke with an expectant look on his face. The fan was reopened. Well, as it turns out, being around Ichigo has led to some rather interesting developments that I'll explain later. For now, just know this will be the team that will infiltrate the Siri-IDI. Naruto gave everyone a quick look, and apart from Ichigo, who was constantly leaking Ryatsu, none of them were really anything special. Still, if Kasuke was confident enough to send them, he had to have seen something in them. Sighing, he spoke. "Alright, before we start, might as well just get an introduction out of the way. This is my wife Kukaku, who will be joining us up until it's actually time to invade. Please don't piss her off," he requested. "Wait, hold on," Ichigo ordered, upset that his questions hadn't been answered. Seeing his homeroom teacher was not what he was expecting at all and was rightfully full of questions. Unfortunately for him, his new sensei had other plans and clapped his hands. Now Ichigo, there will be time for questions later. Naruto and Kukaku along with Yoruichi will be your guides. Since I can see the confusion in your eyes, just know that they're old friends of ours, and like you." He trailed off. His hand quickly shot 2 small orbs which were easily caught by the pair. Naruto and Kukaku ate the orb, and suddenly, they separated from their bodies and back in their old Shinigami clothing. Both Ichigo and Uryu frowned at the clothing since it wasn't at all reminiscent of the traditional clothing the Death Gods wore. "I remember how much shit they used to give me for these," Naruto recounted with a smile. It was the only good memory he had of the clan elders before they were killed. Kukaku shook her head but was quickly led away by the small cat to get her something that fit better. As good as she looked in the small red shirt and white fabric, it didn't exactly look the same now that she was expecting. "They're Shinigami," Kasuke finished. "Their bodies will stay here inhabited by mod souls while they're out." His face suddenly lost its playful demeanor, taking on his serious persona. "I know everyone here has some sort of questions, but let's focus on what's important right now, and that's getting you safely to Soul Society." Ichigo and his friends all gave the man his complete attention while he explained how the Dangai worked and what they would have to do to make it safely. As the explanation went on, he felt a small bundle land on his shoulder and Kukaku taking her place at his side. "This won't be as easy as Ichigo thinks," Yoruichi told them from her spot. "I'm aware. I assume that's why Kasuke is sending you too." The cat nodded. "Do you have a plan for when we arrive?" Kukaku asked in a low tone. Yoruichi nodded again. "I doubt it'll go as smoothly as we've discussed, but for the most part yes. Though I have to wonder, she said, turning her golden eyes towards Naruto. What's your plan? The blonde raised an eyebrow. Kukaku is going to see her family. I'm going to make sure the group stays alive. I know you are too, but knowing you as long as I have, I know there's another reason you'd be willing to go back to that place. Now both women were staring at him and he had to nod to her. Yoruchi was astute. After we get to Kukaku's house I plan on going on ahead, not only to scope the place out but to visit my parents. Oh yeah, they were away that night when you destroyed the compound. You didn't even get the chance to say goodbye to them. His wife said softly. The Namikaze clan estate has been completely rebuilt so you won't have to worry about having to find them. The only thing you'll need to do is make sure you aren't noticed by other families or older Shinigami. There's a chance most won't know you so you have that advantage. Yoruchi replied, turning her gaze back to Kisuke and the others. Naruto nodded but didn't verbally respond. Part of him was still going over how he would approach them. From what Yoruchi and Kisuke told him when they came down to the world of the living, they didn't seem all that surprised by his actions but were definitely heartbroken that he had disappeared. It wasn't as if he could just walk through the front door acting like nothing had happened. He shook his head, overthinking it wouldn't help. He'd just wing it like he'd done everything else. Finally, after a few more minutes, Kisuke wrapped up the explanation and motioned them to join him. Are you ready? He asked. Ichigo and the others nodded, as did the three older Shinigami. I'll attempt to hold it open for 4 minutes. Good luck everyone. Wasting no time, Ichigo took the lead with the others hot on his trail. Taking a deep breath, the three followed, ready to take on the task at hand. So this is Soul Society, huh? Ichigo comments, looking around the area. Not exactly what I pictured the afterlife would look like. Naruto chuckled. You're telling me. Yoruchi hopped off his shoulder, landing safely on the ground before proceeding forward. Stop wasting time. We need to make our way inside the gate, she said, pointing with her tail. Everyone looked to see a massive wall that seemed to surround another area. We'll have to make it past the gate guard and go from there. Ichigo, wait, she yelled in annoyance. The orange-haired teen had a one-track mind and was already making his way over. Naruto shook his head. At least we know he's serious about saving Rukia. Kid wasted no time. Kukaku rolled her eyes at the display and walked down the deserted street they were on. Shouldn't you be making sure he doesn't get killed by Jidanbo? She asked Yoruchi. If a cat could sigh, she would. I'm sure he'll be fine but I'll go on ahead. You guys gonna be alright making it to Kukaku's house? The black-haired woman smiled at her old friend. We'll be fine. If anything goes bad just stop by and we'll make a plan from there. With her piece being said, the cat took off in pursuit of the teenagers, leaving them alone once more. It's strange being back here, isn't it? She commented. Yeah. Not in a bad way though. Come on, let's get to your house. I'm sure your brother will be happy to see you. It wasn't hard to find her home. The two large hands holding a banner all but announcing it made sure of that. Naruto took Kukaku's hand in his and gave it a reassuring squeeze. Nervous? He asked. She nodded. A little bit, she replied as they walked up towards the small house. Once they were a few yards away, they stopped and Kukaku smiled. Suddenly, two people appeared in front of them with their arms crossed, stern looks on their faces. They wore identical clothing consisting of a red hat with a white tassel, blue scarf, and matching shirt. The only difference was that one wore a white shirt while the other sported a yellow one. They had similar thin mustaches and the only way to tell them apart was due to the facial structures. One had a rather narrow elongated face while the other's was a tad wider. Their eyes looked over the pair and the stern expressions quickly changed to one of immense happiness and disbelief. Kukaku? Is that really you? Naruto too? They asked at the same time. The woman smiled brightly at them. Koga no Hiko, Shirogane no Hiko. She greeted. Naruto noticed their eyes travel down towards her stomach and their already wide eyes seemed to get wider. Hey guys. Been a long time. The two were quickly on them, enveloping them in a bright hug before coming to their senses and bowing. We apologize. We're just happy to see you two are okay and are doing well. Kukaku waved them off. It's fine. I appreciate the concern, really. Is Ganju in? Shirogane no Hiko nodded. Yes. Please follow us. I'm sure he'll be happy to see you too. He replied, making his way into the house. The past few years have been rough on him, but he's come a long way from the rowdy boy he used to be. He's behaving more like Kaien now. I know you'll be proud of him. Naruto couldn't imagine the childish kid he used to fight with on occasion being mature now, but he supposed with the circumstances it was bound to happen. The two guards made idle small talk with them, asking how they had been and what the name of their son would be once he was born. The blonde was sure his wife had a name in mind, and if it was what he thought it was, he wouldn't refuse it. They were led to two sliding doors which were promptly opened to reveal a larger man, kneeling on the ground writing with a large calligraphy pen. He wore a white bandana on his head along with a yellow jacket over a white robe held together by a red sash. The man had an intense look of concentration on his face as his hand glided across the paper. Had this been years ago, Naruto would have snuck up behind him to break his concentration for fun, but even he could see the difference in the man. "Ganju," Koganehiko called out respectfully. "You have guests." The man looked up from his work and his eyes immediately landed on his pregnant sister. Shock was written clear on his face for a split second before his eyes began to water. Naruto stepped aside and watched with a happy smile as the man yelled her name and rushed to embrace his sister. The man pulled back and placed his hands on her stomach with a joyful look on his face. "I'm going to be an uncle?" he asked excitedly. "Wait, let's talk somewhere else. Shiraganehiko, Koganehiko, can you two set up a few plates outside?" he asked politely. The two guards nodded and disappeared from their place. "Follow me. We can catch up out back. Watch your step," he warned Kukaku, moving aside a small crate that she could have easily walked around. "Can't have you tripping over." The woman rolled her eyes but felt elated at the fact that her brother was already treading lightly around her due to her expecting. Part of her wondered how he would react to the news, but seeing it now filled her with joy she hadn't felt in a long time. There were only 3 times she could recount that brought this feeling: when they married, when she found out they were going to be parents, and now. Once out back, they were seated on a few seats that Ganju had ordered set out and began catching up on everything. How Ganju had adjusted to taking over leadership of the family, what he'd done since they'd been gone, and so on. Likewise, he was fully interested in knowing how his sister and brother-in-law had been over the past years. Naruto would answer a few questions here and there, but for the most part kept quiet. This was what Kukaku had wanted, and he wanted her to enjoy it. The two went over every detail of their lives and exchanged moments that they wished the other could have been there for. By the time most of the catching up had gotten done, the sun had disappeared into the horizon already and the dark had completely enveloped the area. The only light shining was from inside the house. "It's been tough ever since Kain died, and there were moments where I wish you could have been here, but I know things turned out better for you in the world of the living," Ganju said to them. "Having said that, what's your plan?" Kukaku yawned and stretched her arms above her head. "Well, that's another thing we'll need to discuss, but can we do it tomorrow? I'm feeling tired." Ganju nodded quickly and ordered for a room to be prepared. "Yeah, no problem. Just find Koganehiko and he'll lead you to your room." She nodded and grabbed Naruto by the hand to take him with her, only for him to shake his head. "I'll join you in a minute. I need to talk to Ganju." She looked at them for a split second and nodded. "Don't take long, you know I can't sleep well without you." Ganju made a face and shook his head. It didn't matter that they were married or that he'd known they slept together even when they were still living here. No one wanted the image of their sister in bed with a man. Once she was gone, Naruto turned to her brother. "I know I don't need to ask this of you, but please keep her safe while we're here. We're actually here to break someone out of the Siriidii, so things are bound to get messy." The man nodded. "Of course, but aren't you going to be here too?" The blonde shook his head. "I'm going to infiltrate tomorrow and make a quick stop to see my parents and from there join up with the others. I just wanted to make sure she made it here safely and is in good hands. You can count on me. Now let's go. The last thing we need is my sister upset at being kept waiting." He shuddered. The following morning was strange, to say the least. He'd expected to wake up to a slightly moody Kukaku, breakfast, and another chat with Ganju. Seeing Yoruichi along with Ichigo and his friends again so soon definitely wasn't what he'd expected. As it turned out, things hadn't gone as simple as they had wanted. Ichigo had managed to beat the guardian of the gate, and just as they were granted entry, they were stopped by the captain of the 3rd Division, who easily denied them entry and forced them to retreat. Now here they were, going over a plan to quite literally break into the Siriidii by being blasted in. He stuck around for a few more hours before deciding it was time to head out. After letting everyone in on his plan, he let them know they'd meet up once more within the walls of the Siriidii and headed out. The blonde wandered the streets of the Rukongai, his eyes darting left and right, looking for the perfect target that would allow him entry into the Siriidii. It didn't take long before he found a single Shinigami dressed in the standard attire, probably on patrol. He smiled to himself and moved. "Don't have that much time," Naruto muttered to himself as he made his way toward the old compound. The Shinigami that he'd jumped and robbed of his clothing would wake up eventually and let it be known that there was an intruder. Perhaps there'd be a chance it would be pinned on some lowly thief from the Rukongai, but if the captain of the 3rd Division reported already, Then his words would only increase security. He walked as fast as he could without drawing attention to himself. Most wrote him off and went on with their duties, but some stared. Even now as he walked up towards the large gates, he could feel eyes on the back of his head. The compound was pretty well secluded, being built on a rather large bit of land away from most of the divisions. Which means they added extra security around, he thought, coming to a stop at the front gate. His hands stretched out and seemingly grabbed the air before pulling, revealing two hidden men dressed in all black. They were momentarily stunned but quickly sprang into action. Their zanpakutos were drawn in the blink of an eye and their ryatsu fluctuated due to the Kaido spell hiding them being disrupted. Naruto's gaze stayed fixated on his rebuilt home, uncaring of the blades currently closing the gap between them. Unknown to the two guards, beneath the uniform, Naruto's skin had hardened with a partial transformation. The blades connected with his body before shattering cleanly in half, much to their disbelief. That moment of surprise was all Naruto needed. His arms shot out, creating two large red orbs in his palms that he quickly fired. The incantation less Hado 31 were larger than the average and easily incapacitated the two. Their bodies laid on the ground, smoke rising from the burns they now suffered. Pushing the gate open, he walked up to the front door and paused. Should I just walk in? He thought. Deciding against it, he simply knocked and waited a minute before the door was opened. Naruto blinked, not knowing what to say to the red-headed woman staring back at him with wide eyes. He wasn't given the chance to speak as his mother quickly pulled him into a crushing hug while crying into his shoulder. The maids all stopped what they were doing to see, and those who still worked for his family looked shocked to see him as well. His arms quickly wrapped around his mom and let her cry for a few minutes until she finally let go of him. Wiping her eyes, she smiled up at him. "Welcome home," she said. "Minato!" she yelled. An older-looking man with blonde hair poked his head out of one of the rooms and, like his wife, quickly made his way over to embrace his son. "It's good to see you, son. It's good to see you guys too." "I'm sorry for what?" he began, only to get cut off. Minato shook his head. "No, we shouldn't have let the elders have that much of a say in the clan matters, and we shouldn't have left you alone for so long. We've blamed ourselves for what happened all those years ago and have been waiting for the chance to apologize for everything." Kushina sniffled and accepted a tissue from the head maid. Naruto blinked in surprise to see that the one maid who he always had to explain why he was missing to the elders had now become the head maid. "Head maid, huh?" he asked casually. The young woman stood up straight and nodded. "Yes. After you destroyed the compound, the head maid worried about it happening again and resigned. Seeing as I was the one who had to look after you here, they promoted me." Naruto rubbed the back of his neck in slight embarrassment having his episode recalled like that. "Well, I'm happy for you. It's the least they could do since I'm sure the elders gave you a hard time for how I behaved." He apologized while bowing much to his parents' delight. The woman smiled. "It seems your time away has made you mature. Would a certain Shiba be the cause of it? Or is it Namikaze now?" she asked while her eyes darted to his hand. His parents followed her line of sight and Kushina gasped seeing the ring on his left hand. "My baby is married?" his mom asked. Minato smiled and gripped his shoulder tightly while giving him a congratulations. "Okay, I have to hear all about this. Where's Kukaku? I want to see how my daughter-in-law is doing." Naruto smiled at his parents, enjoying the feeling of being back with them. This has to be exactly how Kukaku felt when she met Ganju again, he thought. She's with Ganju right now. She can't move much because she's almost due. He replied happily, knowing his parents would pick up on his meaning. They did. His mom grabbed his arm and all but forced him and his dad to another room to talk in peace. Naruto was plopped onto the small sofa and was forced to recount what he and his wife had been up to all those years. His parents wanted every detail of his life story, and not once did the smile leave their faces as he spoke. "Wait," Minato interjected. "So, if Kukaku is pregnant, why did she come here knowing how dangerous it is for you guys?" Naruto sighed. "You know what she's like." Kushina nodded happily. "She's the only person other than me who could keep you in line. You even had all the maids clean up the estate the first time she was coming over." She recounted happily. "I tried reasoning with her but in the end, I caved as long as she agreed to stay out of the line of fire. It would be too hard to sneak around with her the way she is now." Minato nodded. "Your criminal status doesn't help either. We couldn't even make a case since you weren't around at the time, but maybe we can now. The only obstacle will be the amount of collateral damage that was done to the surrounding areas. The rest could be nothing more than an internal clan affair." Minato finished. "That might be able to work, but you'd have to be able to convince the Central 46, and you know what they're like. I'm glad I never had to deal with them, but those relics are just as bad as the elders, Naruto commented. The red-headed woman shook her head. I'm sure we can think of something. Enough about that though, how long are you going to be here? Not long. I just wanted to see you guys and make sure everything was okay. I have other things I have to do around here. His mother sighed but understood. He wasn't here for a social visit after all. His parents hugged him once more and led him out, but not before letting him know he and Kukaku were welcome anytime regardless of what was going on. Once he was back outside, he began his recon. Walking down the large streets of the Suryaidai, he glanced around, taking in every detail. Transferring your powers is against the law. Chances are she'll be made an example of, meaning she should end up on Sokayaku Hill, he thought. Although he knew where that was, it wasn't where he was headed. Soon after leaving his old home, he could feel eyes on his back once more. This time it was slightly different, however. The person watching him was strong. Much stronger than the unfortunate guards he'd had to deal with. The Ryatsu he could feel from this one was denser and cold, making a detour for one of the more secluded areas. He walked for about half an hour with the person still hot on his trail, but they made no move to attack. There's other Shinigami around, why not attack? He wondered. Eventually, he made it to an old training ground he used to use when he was younger and stood in the center of the flat plain. We're all alone now, he called out. The familiar sound of someone using Shuinpa reached his ears. Turning around, he came face to face with what appeared to be a young kid. He had white spiky white hair with one strand on his face and wore the standard captain's heir over his black clothing. Captain, Naruto greeted, pretending to know who this was. He didn't look like any of the captains from when he was here. Namikaze Naruto. What are you doing here? He ordered. Naruto stared at the youth with a blank face, wondering if he should play stupid or just go on the offensive. It's impolite to ask questions without introducing yourself, you know. Naruto chastised as if talking to a child. The boy grit his teeth but quickly composed himself. Hitsugaya Toshiro, captain of the 10th Division. The blonde was impressed. He had to be incredibly strong to be a captain so young. Naruto stared back at the captain and felt an old sensation he hadn't felt in a long time. Excitement. Since he lived here, he'd wanted to fight the captains, or anyone really that would make him put his power to good use. It seemed he'd finally get that chance. Tell you what, Naruto replied. I'll tell you if you can beat me, he proposed. Hitsugaya drew his Zanpakuto and narrowed his eyes. Naruto smirked. It looked like tagging along had been the right choice after all. I hope you guys enjoyed this story. If this video gets 1,000 likes, then I will continue this. In the meanwhile, click on this video and I will see you all there.